Hello, my name is Wade Hilmo, and I am here today to talk about how I use my astrophysics mount with NINA and declination arc tracking. Astrophysics introduced a new tracking model called declination arc tracking. And the idea, it's actually a different algorithm, so it's got some slightly different ways that it works internally. The key point is it doesn't need all the points across the sky. It just needs points at the line of declination where your target object is. And so to build a declination arc tracking model, you figure out what your object's declination is, and then every few degrees along the right ascension, you take a sample and you build your model from that. Benefit to that is you get all the goodness of the tracking model and the ability to go unguided if you choose, but you don't need anywhere near the number of points. I typically use around 80 to 100 points, and it takes about 30 minutes to collect. About 2020, I switched to NINA, fell in love with it at the time, and it just keeps getting better and better. Most important for this conversation is they have introduced a plugin specifically for astrophysics mounts that's aware of APCC Pro and APPM, and it can automate working with them, and that's what I want to show today. Tonight, we will be using my AP1600 AE with the absolute encoders, as I mentioned. The telescope is an Astro-Physics AP130 GTX with a QSI 690 camera. The target we'll be selecting is IC410 and the tadpoles. So I will go ahead and get right into it. One of the things I figured I would do is just go ahead and show a photograph. This is the system. I took this picture a couple weeks ago as the rig as it exists right now, and this is the one that we're going to be running tonight. So you can see the telescope, the mount. The case on the ground contains all of the electronics and distribution and power and all of that for the system. So it's highly portable. When I want to switch to the AP1100 and go mobile, I just disconnect a couple cables and close that case. There's two cables that connect the telescope through the mount to the case. So I disconnect those two cables, pull the telescope off with the camera and everything attached, take the case, and I can put those on the AP1100 and image exactly the same way we're going to do tonight. So let's go ahead and get started. First thing we'll do is we will bring up APCC. I power cycled the mount a while ago, so we're going to need to initialize the mount, and we'll use APCC to do that. I'm connected to the mount with an Ethernet cable, and we'll be using the REST API. So I want to check to make sure we have the right IP address for the mount. So I'll click on the button to find it. It found my 1600 AE. So we'll go ahead and select that. Connect. So it's connected to the mount. It's going to go ahead and initialize the mount with my location information here. That's done, and we're ready to go. Next thing we'll do is we'll prepare the camera. I do use an ultimate power box for USB and power distribution. So I'll go ahead and power the camera on. It's now powered up. We'll go to PhD, and I'm going to go ahead and connect to PhD. This is going to connect to my guide camera, and it's also going to connect to the mount. When the system goes to connect to the mount, that's going to trigger the Astrophysics ASCOM driver to start. So let's go ahead and hit connect all. And just briefly on the screen, you can see the ASCOM for Astrophysics to come up. It's now loaded. So everything is now initialized. The next thing to consider is the target we want to image. And we're going to do IC410. So I'll start my planetarium. There's several pieces of planetarium software that work with NINA. I happen to have the SkyX Pro, so that's what I'm going to use. I will just search for IC410. Center that. It's not a particularly great shot of IC410. You can kind of see the tadpoles in here. One thing that I frequently do is I go to Tools, Digitize Sky Survey, and I fill the sky chart. So it's going to download the photo from the DSS library. Close that, and this now gives me a higher fidelity look at what I want to get. So I can frame this however I want. Put it, say, there. I usually make a note of the right ascension and declination. It's at 5 hours and 5 hours of right ascension, 33 minutes declination, 33 degrees declination. So we'll just minimize this out of the way. Now we can bring up Nina. So we're going to start Nina. I just updated Nina, so we're currently using version 2, HF2, downloaded a few days ago. And we will be using a number of plugins. The one relevant today is we'll use the Astrophysics plugin. This was written by Dale Gent, and it provides some nice integration between Nina and the Astrophysics mount. So the general settings, these should look kind of what you would see when you initialize the mount. You'll see that I'm setting the slew rate to 1200x and some other settings there. It is smart enough to know where APPM lives, and it'll use that to start APPM as needed. So I don't even need to think about APPM. This plugin is going to take care of all that along with Nina. Plugin version we're using is version 1. So let's just go ahead and see how this works. First things we'll do is we'll go to the equipment and we'll just start connecting things. There's a connect all button in Nina. I'm a big fan of having everything work exactly the same way every time and to be deterministic. And so instead of hitting that button and just letting Nina connect to everything, I like to do it in the same order every time. And I always start with the camera. So I'll go ahead and bring the camera up. The camera is now connected. I do have a filter wheel on the camera. We'll connect that. I have a focuser. The focuser I'm using is the focus that came with the AP130 GTX, and I'm using a Starlight Instruments HSM35 focus motor to run it. That works through I'm using the Ultimate Power Box V2 to control the focuser. It also manages dew and power distribution and data distribution. We'll connect to the telescope. Before I get too much further, I do want to make a note here. The telescope is currently in Park 3, and this is where most of us set the scope up. I live in a large field, and we have a lot of eagles and hawks and birds, and they like to perch on the telescope. And so I never take the dust cap off the telescope when it's in Park 3, because the birds will do their business on it, and that does not make me happy. So the first thing we'll do is we'll put the telescope into Park 5, so it is safe in case a bird decides to land on it. Park 5. And we'll just let it go. You can watch on the scope view. You can see the telescope moving into position. And this way, even if a bird does find its way onto the telescope, there's no way it can do anything to foul my lens. So now we go back to Nina, continue connecting. We'll go ahead and connect to the telescope. So this is I'm using the beta software. I've never seen this error happen before. I'm going to go ahead and do from telescope to Nina, but I'm going to go ahead and do it without my side chatter. So there'll be some things for you to edit here. So we'll go ahead and connect to the telescope. It's noticed that the longitude and latitude are slightly different. We'll go ahead and pull the data from the telescope and set it in Nina. So that's done, and the mount is now connected. Next thing we'll do is we'll connect the guider. A couple things I want to show you here. First thing I want to show you is when I connect the guider, Nina starts the guider imaging. So I have to hit the stop button. And so that'll stop it from, otherwise it would continue to image until the session started later tonight. I want to go ahead and show you the settings I'm using here. In particular, I want to show you the camera settings. Because this is an absolute encoder mount, it falls in the high precision category. And so I'm using variable exposure delays. What this does for me is this just has the guider pause for 10 seconds after each guide image. That's great because I don't have to over guide the mount at that point. It is extremely accurate with the encoders. The downside to that is when I dither, it's going to take multiple iterations of guide exposures to be able to reacquire the guide star. And I don't want to wait 10 seconds between each of those exposures. So that's what this short delay number is. So normally when it's guiding, it'll wait 10 seconds between exposures, but when it's recovering from a dither, it'll do a short delay. So we'll just do the 1 second delay. And this is a fantastic option for these mounts. So PhD is now set up and running. We're all connected. I do have a weather sensor. It's an MG Box V2. This provides temperature, dew point, humidity, and pressure information to APCC Pro, which it then uses to improve the accuracy of the tracking model. As long as we're talking about the declination arc tracking model, I want to show you what that looks like. To do that, we'll go ahead and we'll start APPM, and it will allow me to show you the last model that I built. So I'll bring this up. And if we were seeing an all sky model, what we'd see is we'd see a circle with a whole bunch of points in it. But since we're doing declination arc tracking, the last object I imaged was at this declination. And as you can see, it took a very large number of points in high density, only where I needed it and nowhere else. This makes the declination arc tracking very, very appropriate for mobile imagers or people who don't want to spend a lot of time building a model. This model took about 35 minutes to build, and it can happen before it's astronomical dark. And so it's just part of my normal routine, happens all the time. I always use a declination arc model, whether I'm at home or whether I'm in the field. So now that Nina is all set up and ready to go, let's take a look at our sequence. We're going to build a new sequence, and I don't like to build them from scratch. There's a lot of things that go into them. And so what I'll do is I'll pick the last similar sequence that I used. And so my sequences, IC410 is a narrowband object, so I'm going to use narrowband filters. The last thing, my last imaging session was IC342, which is a galaxy. I don't use narrowband filters on that one. However, Malot 15, the center of the Heart Nebula, is narrowband, so I'll go ahead and just open that sequence up. And the first thing I will do is I will hit the button right here, which gets coordinates from the planetarium. So if you remember, I picked IC410. We're expecting the rate ascension to be about 5 hours. We're expecting the declination to be about 33 degrees. So we'll hit the button, do a sanity check, 5 hours, 33 degrees. I'm assuming if those are correct, the minutes and seconds will also be correct. I do want to put the name of the object in here. And then I organize all of my imaging sessions by date they were created and the objects. So today is the 20th. So October 20th, IC410. So now I can save this as a new session or a new sequence. So we're done. At this point, if I go over to imaging, I could just hit the start button and the system will go. I don't need to do anything else. I come back tomorrow morning and I've got my data. And it will have built the model and it'll give me all the great tracking with the declination arc tracking and collect everything I asked it to. Let's take a closer look at what it's going to do. So I start my sessions by waiting for the sun to drop below the horizon about 4 degrees. That's way too early to start imaging, but it's a good time to turn the camera cooler on. So set the camera to -10 and let it cool off. Then what I'll do is I'll wait for the sun to set a little bit more. When it gets to 9 degrees below the horizon, then it's dark enough to start building a model, focusing, plate solving, and doing all that good stuff. And so at -9 degrees, we'll unpark the scope. I have a couple of delays set in here. I did see a situation with Nina where it would occasionally claim that it was still parked when it went to do the plate solve. And so what would happen is the plate solve would issue a slew command. The slew command would fail because the mount was parked, and then everything would fail to run at that point. And I wouldn't get a session. I believe what was going on in that case is a race condition. I think that it's possible that the commands to unpark the scope and set tracking were happening closely enough together that there might have been some confusion in there. Nina is multi-threaded. It's capable of doing multiple things at the same time. And so the order might be non-deterministic. So I introduced these delays that solved the problem. And I don't see that anymore. It's entirely possible the Nina folks have fixed that problem, but I still have the workaround in place because it works. Once I get something that works, I tend to stick with it. So now the mount, at this point, the mount is unparked and tracking and ready to go. We get to our target. Nina is smart enough to look at these coordinates, and it'll look at this 33 degrees, 24 minutes, and 54.2 seconds, and it'll use that as the baseline for building the declination arc tracking model. So I don't need to do anything at all to tell Nina how to build the model. It just does it based on the coordinates from the session itself. At that point, the system starts. We wait for the target object to be higher than 20 degrees. I do a slew and center. That'll give the telescope, unless I do that slew and center, the scope is still parked and it's still in park 5, and so it won't be able to take a picture and plate solve. So the slew and center points me at something interesting, the target I'm going to image, and then it runs the autofocus. And then it does the create Dec Arc model. And this one item here is what triggers APPM to start up and take the samples necessary for the model. When it's done doing that, it'll save the points in a file, and it'll automatically configure APCC Pro to use that model. I don't need to do anything else. This one item is here, and every time I change my target object, I get the correct model. After doing the Dec Arc model, I just do one more slew and center. I do that simply because the model itself left the telescope in a different position than it started. So this gets me back on target. I am configured to dither after every 3 exposures. I will do a focus. I'll do a refocus on a 1.5 degree temperature change. And this next one, the autofocus after time, isn't strictly necessary. This is here because I've seen some cases where the autofocus goes wrong, and I don't want to lose the entire night. And so if the temperature doesn't change again and I got a bad autofocus, then I'll lose the entire night. So every hour I focus it whether it needs it or not. And that guarantees that I never lose more than an hour. And it's really rare that that happens. But this is just kind of insurance. And then it'll automatically handle the meridian flip. I asked it to loop for 200 iterations. It's not going to go 200 times through here. The reason I do this is when I exit Nina and save the session, it'll store the number of iterations that it already did. So on a multi-night project, it might do a dozen tonight, a dozen tomorrow night, and a dozen the night after that. When I had this number set small, occasionally what would happen is it would reach the number I asked for in the middle of the night, and then it would image for half the night and then park itself for the rest of the night. And so I always set this to a huge number of iterations that I don't expect to complete. It will continue imaging until the object drops below 20 degrees, or until the sun is higher than 9 degrees below the horizon. And that's what will trigger the session to stop. During the loop, it'll start guiding. I have the force calibration off. PhD2 will remember the calibration. And so as long as I don't reorient the camera, there's no reason for me to do another one. And then I like to set my dithering up. You notice I had the dithering set for 3 exposures. I like to have it dither for every single exposure for a given filter. And so I'm going to be imaging with the HA filter, the O3 filter, and the sulfur filter. And then I can dither after that. I only got one shot out of each filter, and then it dithered. And so then I'll do some light exposures. And I see it's actually making me a little bit of a liar here because it's going to do 3. It is not. It's going to do another set of exposures. It's going to do a 10-minute luminance exposure, followed by a red exposure, a green exposure, a blue exposure. And then it's going to redo the HA, O3, and sulfur. And what that'll do is that'll have the dithering work the way that I want it. So every exposure per filter is dithered, but I don't dither any more often than I have to. And then when it reaches one of the finish triggers, which is the altitude of the sun and the object, it'll wrap up, it'll park the scope, and I will be ready to collect the data from it the next day. And that's kind of where we're at. If I don't do anything else now, this is all just going to happen based solely on what I've done here. So that's kind of it in a nutshell, what one of my typical imaging sessions looks like. I'd like to show you a little bit more about the plugin we're using. This is the Astrophysics plugin. I went over the general settings here. This just basically configures Nina to know how to use the plugin and how to initialize the scope. It has the ability to build 2 different types of models automatically. I'm not going to spend any time on the all sky model because that really would be something that you don't do every session. If you have a permanent observatory at home, you build one of those and leave it in place for a long period of time. The Dec Arc model, this is the interesting one. What I do is I tell the system that I want 3 declination arcs. Excuse me. There'll be one arc directly on the declination of the target, and then one arc 1 degree north and one arc 1 degree south. And then I'm going to take a sample every 3 degrees of right ascension. And so that's going to give me a very high density of sample points. And that's what you saw when I showed the APPM screenshot a while ago. It has the ability to do an hour angle lead in. And what this says, it says, yeah, the target may be close to the meridian now. It's going to cross the meridian soon. But I want to go ahead and back up and start taking my declination arc when the object is earlier in the east than it'll be tonight. I don't usually do that. As the days progress and Earth orbits the sun, objects tend to move west. So at the same time every night, each object will be a little bit further west the next day. And so I find it to be efficient to not collect any points further east than I need. The declination ordering and the proximity ordering, these directly map to the options in APPM, the point ordering strategy here, for example. So those just map straight through. And that's about it. I just need to tell it to do that, and it'll do everything else automatically. Once these settings here are done, I never really need to go back and change them. So this is just a configuration time. You might want to experiment with this when you first get started. I've tried a number of things, and I find these settings tend to give me a very accurate model that can build in a reasonable amount of time and be very accurate.